In 1897, Kansas, a widowed horse trainer was about to expose a conspiracy that had controlled her town for 15 years. What started as purchasing a condemned building for her last 90 cents took a shocking turn when she discovered what powerful men had buried inside its walls. Marjorie Joe Calder wasn't your typical frontier woman. For decades, she had spent her life working with horses and understanding the language of brands and ledgers. Known for her quiet intelligence and unyielding moral compass, when she knocked loose a hidden cubby in the third stall and pulled out a rusted horseshoe stamped with initials that matched a secret ledger, she had no idea she was walking into a web of theft that had destroyed her own family. Joe made a choice that would lead to a public reckoning. At the territory's biggest livestock auction, what began as a desperate purchase with her last coins would become an investigation that unraveled. 15 years of organized horse theft, forged documents, and corrupted law enforcement. The town of Cardin's Hollow would never be the same after a woman with nothing left to lose proved that truth could shift ground that powerful men believed they owned forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I bought a decaying livery stable for 90 cents. That was all the money I had left that morning in 1897, standing in the dust of Cardin's Hollow with my son waiting 3 miles back at what used to be our ranch. The stable sat at the edge of Main Street like a broken tooth, its paint flaking in strips, doors split by sun and neglect, roof sagging under its own rot. Anyone with sense would have walked past it. But sense is a luxury for people who still have choices. The deed was notarized by Sheriff Amos Pike himself, his signature looping across the bottom like he was doing me a kindness. He smiled when I counted out the coins. 9 dimes that clinked against his palm with a sound that made my jaw tight. He said the place was mine now, all legal and proper, and that he hoped I knew what I was taking on. His eyes held something I recognized but could not name. Not pity, not curiosity. Something closer to caution. I took the deed and folded it into my coat pocket without answering. Men like Pike measured you by how much you spoke, and I had learned years ago to give them nothing to weigh. The stable smelled like failure when I pushed open the east door. Dust hung in the air thick enough to taste. The stalls were empty except for mouse droppings and straw gone grey with age. Warped beams groaned overhead. I walked the length of the building, my boots stirring clouds that caught the morning light slanting through gaps in the walls. The place had been condemned 2 years ago, maybe longer. No one wanted it. No one except a widowed horse trainer with 90 cents and a need for something that resembled a foothold. I found a broom handle in the corner, snapped in half but still usable. I started sweeping, not because I believed I could make the place clean, but because I needed to move, to do something with my hands that was not counting what I had lost. The bristles scraped against the floorboards, pushing dirt into corners that probably had not been touched since before my husband died. I worked methodically, stall by stall, my mind cataloguing what could be salvaged and what would have to be rebuilt from nothing. It was in the 3rd stall that the broom knocked loose a slat near the floor. The wood fell away with a crack that echoed in the empty space, revealing a dark hollow behind the wall. I crouched down, my knees protesting, and reached inside. My fingers touched leather first, cracked and brittle, then paper, then metal. I pulled out a ledger bound in what used to be good leather. The pages were yellowed, the edges soft with age, but the ink was still legible. Beside it was a horseshoe, rusted orange and brown, with initials stamped into the iron, BG. The letters were crude but deliberate, burned into the metal like a brand. I sat back on my heels and opened the ledger. The first page held dates going back 15 years. Beside each date were initials, numbers, and marks I did not immediately understand. Some entries had small symbols drawn in the margins, triangles, circles, lines that intersected at odd angles. I flipped through the pages slowly, my pulse beginning to drum in my ears. The handwriting changed several times, but the format remained consistent. names abbreviated to 2 letters, locations marked with codes, money listed in neat columns that added up to sums I could barely fathom. One entry caught my eye because the date aligned with something I remembered too well. August 14th, 1882, the day before my father's horses were stolen. Beside the date was a notation, C* Eastgate midnight, Pen B, and a payout figure that made my hands start to shake. C* was my father's brand. The star burned into the right shoulder, the C curved around it like a crescent moon. I had watched him apply it to foals, his hands steady, the iron hissing against hide. Those horses had vanished in a single night, along with 6 others. My father had gone to Sheriff Pike. Pike had nodded and taken notes and promised to investigate. Nothing was ever found. My father's ranch collapsed under debt 2 years later. We lost everything except the clothes we wore and the knowledge that someone had taken what was ours and would never be held accountable. Now I held proof in my hands that the theft had not been random, that it had been planned, that someone had recorded it like a business transaction. I looked at the horseshoe again. BG. I knew those initials. Everyone in Carden's Hollow knew them. Bartholomew Granger, the wealthiest trader in the territory, the man who built an empire buying stock from desperate families and reselling it through rail auctions, the man whose name appeared on half the deeds in town. I wrapped the ledger and horseshoe in my coat and stood. My legs felt unsteady, but my mind was clear. I locked the stable door behind me, the key heavy in my palm. The building was mine now, bought for 90 cents, and inside its warped beams and rotting wood, I'd found something worth more than any amount of money. I had found the truth. The next morning, I walked Main Street with the ledger hidden in a cloth sack under my arm. I told myself I was running errands, checking feed prices, asking after work, but every question I asked was aimed at something deeper. The feed store was first, a low building with sacks stacked floor to ceiling and a smell of molasses and grain dust. The clerk was a young man named Thomas, whose father had sold us hay back when we still had land to grow it on. He nodded when I entered and asked what I needed. I set the sack on the counter, but did not open it. I asked about auction schedules, when the big sales happened, how often rail buyers came through. Thomas answered easily at first, reciting dates and names like he was reading from a printed schedule. Then I asked about the old East Gate pens, the ones near the abandoned rail spur. His face went still. He said those pens had not been used in years. I asked why. He looked past my shoulder toward the door and said he did not know. His hands moved to straighten sacks that did not need straightening. I thanked him and left, the lie sitting between us like something we could both see but refused to name. The blacksmith was next, a man named Cord, with forearms thick as fence posts and a face that had been weathered by forge heat until it looked like old leather. I asked him about brands. How often did people commission new irons? How much did it cost to alter an existing mark? His hammer stopped mid-swing. He set it down carefully and looked at me with eyes that held no warmth. He said most folks did not alter brands. That was a thing you did once and kept. Unless, he added slowly, you were cleaning up after a bad inheritance or a partnership gone wrong. He did not ask why I wanted to know. I did not offer an explanation. I left with the name of a term ringing in my head, broker's rate. Cord had let it slip when talking about commission costs, then caught himself and turned back to his anvil. Broker's rate appeared 3 times in the ledger, always beside the initials A.P. Amos Pike. I was halfway back to the stable when the sheriff intercepted me on the boardwalk. He appeared from the marshal's office with his hat tilted at an easy angle and his smile as smooth as Sunday preaching. He said it was good to see me settling in. Asked how the stable was holding up. Said he hoped I was not working too hard or digging through too much old rot. The way he said rot made my spine straighten. He knew, or he suspected. I kept my face neutral and told him the building needed work, but nothing I could not handle. He nodded slowly, his eyes traveling from my face to the sack under my arm and back again. He said that sometimes old buildings held old problems, that stirring dead dust could bring up things best left buried, that if I needed advice, his door was always open. I thanked him and kept walking. Behind me, I heard his boots stay planted on the boardwalk, his gaze following me until I turned the corner. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I did not look back. Men like Pike traded on fear. If you showed it, they owned you. That evening I spread the ledger across the table in the stable's back room and matched entries to memories. August 1882, my father's horses. March 1884, the Porter Ranch foreclosure. November 1886, a widow's stock sold at auction for a quarter of its worth. Every major loss in 15 years appeared in those pages, coded and categorized like the movements of inventory. The symbols in the margins were not random. They corresponded to pen locations. The triangles marked the East Gate route. The circles marked cash payouts. The intersecting lines marked shipments that went directly to rail without local record. Carden's Hollow was not just a town that looked away. It was a town built on theft that had been made to look like misfortune. And everyone who mattered knew I needed someone with memory, not reputation, not power, someone who had been there when the crimes were still fresh and who might still carry the weight of what they had seen. Needed old Jasper Millen. I found Jasper 3 miles south of town where the creek bent, around a stand of cottonwoods. He was living in a canvas lean-to with a bedroll that smelled like sweat and whiskey. A dented tin cup sat beside a jug that was mostly empty. He looked up when I approached, his eyes red-rimmed and cautious. He asked what I wanted. I told him I needed to talk about the livery stable, about the years he worked there before it closed. He said he did not remember much, that his memory was poor and getting worse, that I should ask someone else. I sat down on a log across from him and pulled the horseshoe from my coat. The rusted metal caught the afternoon light. I set it on the ground between us. Jasper stared at it like I'd placed a rattlesnake at his feet. His hands started to shake. He reached for the jug and took a long swallow, then another. When he finally looked at me, his face had gone gray. He said one word, Granger. I asked him what he knew. He shook his head and said knowing and proving were different things. I pulled out the ledger and opened it to a page marked with pen B and the initials BG. I asked him if the symbols meant what I thought they meant. He looked at the page for a long time, his finger tracing lines he did not touch. He said stock came through the East Gate at night. Horses that were not supposed to be there. He said they arrived with one brand and left with another. That Granger had men who could work an iron fast and clean, scrubbing marks until the skin was raw and then burning in something new. He said he had been paid to keep his mouth shut, and he had taken the money because he needed to eat. That he had told himself it was not his business. That he had spent 15 years trying to forget what he had seen. I asked him about my father's horses, the ones with the Sea Star brand. Jasper closed his eyes and nodded. He said he remembered a stallion with a split ear, distinctive, impossible to hide. He said that horse had come through the East Gate on an August night and left 2 days later with a fresh brand and a bill of sale that said it had been raised on Granger land. He said the stallion sold at a rail auction in Abilene for more money than my father made in 5 years. I asked him why he never spoke. He looked at me with eyes that held nothing but shame and exhaustion. He said he had been afraid, that Pike was on the payroll and the judge was Granger's cousin, and that speaking up would have gotten him killed or worse, gotten him framed for something he did not do. He said silence was survival, that he hated himself for it, but he had survived. I asked if there was proof, documents, bills of sale with the old brands still visible underneath. Jasper said there might be, that Lydia Boone, the seamstress, used to bind ledgers for Granger's office, that she was careful and quiet and kept her stitches even. He said if anyone had seen something worth hiding, it would be her. He looked at the horseshoe again and then at me. He asked what I planned to do. I told him the truth, that I was going to expose every name in that ledger, that I was going to make sure people knew what had been done and who had done it, that I was tired of watching powerful men bury the truth under the weight of money. Jasper nodded slowly. He said I should be careful, that men like Granger did not lose quietly, that I had a son to think about. I told him I was thinking about my son, That I wanted him to grow up knowing his mother fought for what was right, even when it was dangerous. Jasper picked up the horseshoe and turned it over in his hands. He said he would testify if it came to that. That he was old and half-drunk and probably worthless, but that he owed my father at least that much. I thanked him and stood to leave. He called after me, his voice rough with something that might have been hope or might have been dread. He said the ground always shifts in the end. That lies only stay buried as long as people are afraid to dig. I walked back toward town with the ledger under my arm and Jasper's words ringing in my ears. The sun was setting behind me, casting long shadows across the prairie. Somewhere in Carden's Hollow, Lydia Boone was closing her shop for the evening, unaware that I was about to ask her to risk everything she had built. And somewhere in a fine house on the hill, Bartholomew Granger was counting money that had been stolen from people like my father. Money that had bought silence and fear and the illusion of legitimacy. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the ground was shifting. I could feel it under my boots with every step I took, and this time, the truth was not going to stay buried. Lydia Boone's shop sat between the general store and a boarding house that smelled like boiled cabbage. The sign above the door read, "Alterations and fine stitching," in letters that had been repainted so many times the wood beneath was probably more paint than grain. A bell chimed when I entered. The front room was narrow, lined with bolts of fabric and spools of thread. Organized by color, everything was precise, orderly, the kind of space that belonged to someone who noticed details. Other people missed. Lydia emerged from the back room with a measuring tape draped around her neck and pins stuck through the cuff of her sleeve. She was 50, maybe older, with grey hair pinned back tight and eyes that assessed me in a single glance. She asked what I needed. I told her I wanted to speak privately. She looked past me toward the street, then locked the front door and turned the sign to closed. The back room smelled like starch and lavender. A sewing machine sat on a table near the window. Shelves held bolts of linen and wool, buttons sorted into glass jars, needles arranged by size. Lydia gestured toward a chair and remained standing. She said she knew who I was, that she had heard I bought the old livery, that people were talking. I pulled the ledger from my sack and set it on the table between us. Lydia looked at it the way you look at something you recognize but hope never to see again. She did not touch it. I asked if she knew what it was. She said she had bound 3 just like it over the years, that Granger paid her well for careful work and discretion, that she had learned not to read what passed through her hands. I opened the ledger to a page marked with broker's rate and Pike's initials. I asked if discretion included making copies. Lydia's face did not change, but something shifted in her posture. She walked to a cabinet in the corner and pulled out a hat box tied with string. She set it on the table and untied the knots with steady fingers. Inside was a ledger, identical to mine. Same leather, same yellowed pages, but when she opened it, the entries were written in a different hand, cleaner, more complete. Names spelled out in full. Amos Pike, broker's rate. Bartholomew Granger, primary buyer. Locations marked not with symbols, but with addresses and pen numbers. She had copied everything. She said she started keeping records 8 years ago, when Granger's office ordered her to burn an old ledger instead of rebinding it. She said burning evidence did not sit well with someone who made her living keeping seams straight. So she copied what she could before the flames took it. After that, every ledger that passed through her shop was copied in secret. She kept them wrapped in oilcloth inside hat boxes labeled with fabric names no one would question. I asked why she never used them. Lydia sat down across from me and folded her hands in her lap. She said she had been afraid, that she was a woman alone in a town where men controlled everything from the bank to the law, that speaking up would have cost her the shop, her reputation, maybe her life. She said she told herself someone would come eventually, someone who would not scare easy, someone who had already lost enough that fear would not stop them. She looked at me when she said it, and I understood. She had been waiting for someone like me, someone with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. I asked if her ledger matched mine. She turned pages until we found corresponding entries. August 1882, my father's horses. Her ledger listed the transaction in full. Stock acquired through coerced sale, Calder Ranch, rebranded Pen B, Gate G, resold Abilene Rail Auction. Net profit listed in a column that made my throat tight. The BG on the horseshoe was not just initials. It was a location code. Pen B, Gate G, the same gate Jasper had described. The same pen where my father's stallion had been rebranded in the dark. Lydia said she remembered that horse. A colt had come through with a star blaze on its face, distinctive enough that Granger had it shipped out fast. She said she saw the bill of sale when she delivered mended shirts to his office. The colt's papers listed Granger as the original breeder, but she had seen that same colt tied outside my father's barn 3 months earlier. She knew the mark. She knew the lie. I asked if she would stand with me. If the time came to make this public, would she bring her ledgers forward and testify to what she knew? Lydia looked at the pages spread between us. She said she had spent 8 years waiting for someone to ask that question, that she was tired of stitching other people's lies into neat packages, that if I was willing to fight, she would stand beside me. We agreed to move carefully, to gather more proof before we made any accusations public. I told her about Jasper, about the records office, about the freight manifests that might still exist. Lydia said she knew the clerk at the territorial office, that he owed her a favor, that she could request documents without raising suspicion. I told her I needed to bring my son into this, that I would not move forward without him knowing the risks. Lydia nodded and said family should know the truth, even when the truth was dangerous. Especially then. She walked me to the back door to avoid eyes on the street. Before I left, she squeezed my hand once. Her palm was rough from years of needlework, her grip stronger than I expected. She said the ground was shifting, that she could feel it. I told her I had heard that before. She smiled, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had been patient for a very long time and was done waiting. I found Elias at the stable when I returned. He was 15 and tall for his age, with his father's dark hair and my jaw. He had been mucking the stalls, even though we had no horses yet. The work kept him busy, kept him from asking questions I had not been ready to answer. I called him to the back room and spread both ledgers on the table. I told him everything, about the hidden cubby, about Jasper and Lydia, about the horseshoe with Pen B marked in rusted iron, about the night his grandfather's horses were stolen and how it was not bad luck or drifters, but a planned theft. Recorded like a business transaction, Elias listened without interrupting, his hands curled into fists on the table. When I finished, he asked why I had not told him sooner. I said I was trying to protect him. He said I was wrong, that he had a right to know what had been taken from our family, that keeping him ignorant did not keep him safe, it just kept him useless. He was angry, not at the danger, not at the men who had ruined us, at me for thinking he needed to be shielded from the truth. I told him he was right, that I had made a mistake, that if we were going to fight this, we would fight it together. But there would be rules. We would move carefully. We would not give Pike or Granger a clear shot. We would be shadows until we were ready to step into the light. Elias asked what came next. I said we needed to check rail manifests against the auction dates in the ledgers, that we needed documentation from the Territorial Records Office proving the horses were shipped and sold under false brands, that Lydia could get us access, but we would need to copy what we found quickly and quietly. Elias stood and walked to the window. Outside, the street was empty except for a gaunt mare standing near the water trough. She had been lingering around the stable for days, too thin and too wary to approach. Elias said we should feed her. I said we barely had money for ourselves. He said that was not the point, that if we were going to restore this place, we should start by making it somewhere an animal felt safe. He went to the feed barrel and filled a tin with oats. He walked out slowly, speaking low and steady. The mare watched him with ears forward. When he set the tin down and stepped back, she waited a long moment before moving forward. She ate while Elias stood motionless, his patience the kind that could not be taught, only lived into. I watched from the doorway as my son fed a starving horse with the last of our grain. and I understood something I had been too stubborn to see. He was not a boy anymore. He was someone who understood the cost of things and chose to pay it anyway. That evening, we worked on the first stall. We replaced split boards and reinforced the gate. We swept and scrubbed and made something clean out of rot. It was small work, hopeful work, the kind that turns a ruin into a place you might defend. Elias asked what we should call the mare. I said we should not name her until we knew she would stay. He ignored me and called her Penny, a nod to the 90 cents, a reminder of what small things could become when given a chance. Penny stood in the doorway of her new stall and watched us work. She did not come inside, but she did not leave either. That seemed like enough. The Territorial Records Office sat at the end of a side street that never saw much traffic. A squat building with narrow windows and a clerk who looked like he wished he worked somewhere. Else, Lydia had sent word ahead. When we arrived, the clerk had a stack of freight, logs and brand transfer certificates. Waiting on the counter, I asked for manifests, from August 1882 through November 1886. The clerk pulled ledgers from a shelf and set them down without comment. Elias and I worked through them page by page. Every shipment was recorded. Date, origin, destination, stock count, and brand registry. The patterns emerged quickly. Midnight arrivals at the East Gate pens. Stock logged as Origin Granger Holdings. Shipments departing before dawn. Brands listed as G-Bar or Triple G or other marks tied to Granger's registered irons. But underneath the official entries, someone had made notations in pencil. Small marks that looked like corrections or second thoughts. One entry from August 1882 showed a crossed-out line. Beneath it, barely visible, was the original brand notation, C-Star, my father's mark. It had been changed to G-Bar before the manifest was finalized. The shipment went to Abilene, 6 horses, logged as property of Bartholomew Granger. Elias found a brand transfer certificate dated 3 days after the theft. It listed the C-Star brand as voluntarily relinquished by Calder Ranch due to bankruptcy. The signature at the bottom was my father's, but the handwriting was wrong. The loops were too tight, the pressure too heavy. Someone had forged his name. I copied every relevant entry into a notebook. Dates, stock counts, brands, destinations. Elias sketched the penciled notations exactly as they appeared. The clerk watched us work but said nothing. His eyes kept drifting toward the door like he was expecting someone. He was right to be nervous. A shadow fell across the threshold. Sheriff Amos Pike stepped inside with his hat tilted at that same easy angle and his smile just as smooth. He said he was surprised to see me, that he did not expect folks would have business with old freight records, that most people found the past boring. I told him I was checking lineage for stock I hoped to acquire. Pike nodded slowly and walked to the counter. He picked up one of the ledgers and flipped through it. His finger stopped on the page I'd been copying. He asked if I found what I was looking for. I said I was still searching. He closed the ledger and set it down, with a sound that was louder than it needed to be. He said records could be tricky, that sometimes what looked like an error was just poor bookkeeping, that making accusations based on old pencil marks could cause trouble for people who did not deserve it. He let his gaze drift to Elias and then back to me. He said I had a fine son, that it would be a shame if he got caught up in something that was not his concern. The threat was clear. I met Pike's eyes and did not look away. I told him my son knew how to read ledgers and spot lies, that I had taught him well. Pike's smile thinned. He tipped his hat and told the clerk he would be back later to check the filing. Then he left, his boots heavy on the boardwalk outside. The clerk's hands shook when he gathered the ledgers. He said we needed to leave, that Pike had seen enough. I asked for copies of the brand transfer certificates. The clerk shook his head and said he could not risk it. Lydia stepped in then, her voice calm and firm. She reminded him of the coat she had mended for his daughter's wedding, the one she had finished in 2 days when he needed it in 3. She said favors went both ways. The clerk looked between us, then pulled the certificates and made copies with quick, jerky movements. He handed them to me and said not to come back, that he had a family to think about. I thanked him and we left through the back entrance. Outside, Elias asked if Pike would follow through on his threat. I said men like Pike relied on fear more than action. That as long as we moved smart and stayed ahead, he would hesitate to make things public. But I also said we needed to be ready, that private leverage would not work against public rot, that we needed daylight and witnesses. Elias asked how. I said Granger was planning a grand autumn auction, that rail buyers from 3 territories would attend, that if we exposed the scheme in front of men who answered to out-of-town ledgers instead of local friendships, Pike and Granger would not be able to silence us. We walked back toward the stable with our evidence wrapped tight. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. Somewhere ahead, Lydia was mapping auction pens and identifying handlers. Somewhere behind us, Pike was deciding how much risk we posed. The ground was shifting faster now. I could feel it with every step. Word spread through Carden's Hollow that Bartholomew Granger would hold his biggest auction yet. Rail buyers were coming from Kansas City, Abilene, and Dodge. Stock would be premium. Money would be thick as dust. The town buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew Granger's auctions meant profit, jobs, and the kind of prosperity that trickled down to every merchant on Main Street. Lydia, Elias, and I met in the stable's back room to plan. We spread maps of the auction grounds across the table. Lydia had sketched the pen locations from memory, marking each gate and loading chute. Pen B sat at the east end, exactly where the ledgers indicated. Gate G opened onto the rail spur that ran past the old freight depot. I laid out our evidence. 2 ledgers, matched entries showing stock acquired through coercion and fraud. Copied manifests with original brand marks still visible beneath official entries. Forged transfer certificates. The rusted horseshoe stamped BG, physical proof connecting Granger to Pen B, Gate G, and witness testimony from Jasper, who had agreed to identify the handlers who worked the rebranding operation. Elias asked how we would present it. I said we needed a moment when the crowd was focused and the buyers were assembled, when Granger would be standing in front of everyone, confident and untouchable. That was when we would step forward. Lydia said we needed a signal, something visible that would draw attention if Pike tried to stop us. Elias suggested using Penny. The mare had grown stronger on steady feed and careful handling. She would recognize the east gate from scent and sound. If we drove her through at the right moment, people would look. They would see the route where stolen horses had traveled for 15 years. They would connect the physical space to the accusations we made. I said it was risky, that we would only get one chance, that if we failed, Pike would have justification to arrest us and bury the evidence. Lydia said staying silent was riskier, that we had spent too long watching powerful men control the narrative, that it was time to force them to answer in public. We divided tasks. Lydia would position herself near the auctioneer's block with the ledgers and manifests. Jasper would stand in the crowd, ready to point out handlers when called. Elias would hold Penny at the stable until I gave the signal, then drive her through the east gate. I would speak. I would stand in front of buyers and townspeople and rail investors and name what had been done. The day before the auction, Granger came to the stable. I heard his boots on the boardwalk before I saw him. He entered through the open door, dressed in a tailored duster that smelled like bay rum and iron. His face was handsome in the way that men who never doubt themselves are handsome. Confident, entitled, dangerous. He looked around the stable, taking in the repaired stalls and the clean-swept floors. He said I had done good work, that the place looked almost respectable, that it was a shame to see a woman work so hard for something that could be taken away so easily. I asked what he wanted. Granger pulled a folded paper from his coat and set it on the stall gate. He said it was an offer, a fair price for the stable and a ticket on the next train out of Carden's Hollow. Enough money for me and my son to start over somewhere else, somewhere quiet. I asked what would happen if I refused. Granger smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had never been told no by someone who mattered. He said accidents happened at auctions, that crowds were unpredictable, that women who stirred up trouble sometimes found trouble stirred back. He named Lydia then, said it would be a shame if her shop burned down. said fire was common in buildings that old. I felt my hands curl into fists. Granger saw it and his smile widened. He said all I had to do was take the money and leave, that no one would get hurt, that the past would stay buried where it belonged. I picked up the folded paper and tore it in half. I let the pieces fall to the ground between us. I said one sentence, and I said it clearly so there would be no misunderstanding. You branded over my father's mark. Granger's smile disappeared. His eyes went flat and cold. He said I was making a mistake, that I did not understand how things worked in this territory, that men like him built empires while people like me cleaned stalls. He turned to leave, then stopped at the door. He said auctions were crowds, that crowds could be accidents, that I should think about my son. After he left, Elias came in from the back stall where he had been listening. He asked if I was afraid. I said yes, that fear was not weakness. That courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. I said we would move forward, that we would have contingency plans, that if Granger tried to stop us with violence, we would make sure everyone saw it happen. Elias asked what the contingency was. I said if Pike moved on me during the auction, Elias would drive Penny through the east gate immediately, drawing attention to the route and forcing the crowd to watch. That if Granger's men tried to rush the auctioneer's block, Lydia would hand the ledgers to the nearest rail buyer and shout the accusations herself. That we would spread the truth across so many voices they could not silence all of us at once. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the dark, listening to the wind move through the stable's rafters, and thought about everything that could go wrong. I thought about Elias and the cost of dragging him into this fight. I thought about Lydia and Jasper, ordinary people who had decided to risk everything because silence had cost too much already. I thought about my father and the horses he lost, and the way he died believing no one would ever hold the thieves accountable. The ground was shifting. Tomorrow it would break open completely, and when it did, the truth would finally see daylight. The morning of the auction arrived, with a sky so clear it hurt to look at. I woke before dawn, and found Elias already in the stable, brushing Penny until her coat gleamed. He did not look up when I entered. His hands moved in steady strokes, the kind of motion that came from needing something to do with fear. I asked if he slept. He said no. I told him that was honest. We stood together in the half-light, listening to Penny's soft breathing and the creak of the stable settling around us. Elias asked what would happen if we failed. I said we would lose, that Granger would bury the evidence and probably bury us with it, that we would become a cautionary tale about what happens to people who challenge power without enough of it themselves. He asked what would happen if we succeeded. I said we would still lose things, safety, anonymity, the illusion that keeping our heads down would protect us. But we would know we tried, that we stood up when it mattered, that we refused to let the truth stay buried just because powerful men wanted it that way. Elias stopped brushing and looked at me. He said that was enough, that knowing we tried was more than his grandfather ever got, more than most people in Carden's Hollow would ever have. I pulled him close and held him the way I had when he was small and afraid of thunderstorms. His head came to my shoulder now. He was not small anymore. Lydia arrived an hour later, with the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord. She had dressed carefully. Dark skirt, clean blouse, hair pinned back tight. She looked like someone who had been waiting her entire life for this moment and refused to waste it. She asked if I was ready. I said I was terrified. She said good. That terror meant we understood the stakes. Jasper came last, walking slow and deliberate, his clothes brushed clean and his hands steady for the first time in years. He looked at the three of us and said he had not expected to die doing something useful. I told him he was not going to die. He said we would see. There was no fear in his voice, only resignation and something that looked like relief. We reviewed the plan one final time. Lydia would position herself near the auctioneer's block with the ledgers and manifests concealed in a market basket. Jasper would stand among the ranch hands and drovers, ready to identify the men who had worked the rebranding operation. Elias would wait at the stable with Penny until I gave the signal. a raised hand, palm open. That was his cue to drive the mare through the east gate while I spoke. I would wait until Granger took the platform, until the crowd was gathered and the buyers were assembled, until everyone who mattered was watching. Then I would step forward and name what had been done. The auction grounds sat at the edge of town, where the prairie met the rail yards. A maze of pens and chutes, loading ramps and watering troughs. Stock already filled the enclosures, horses switching their tails against flies, cattle lowing in the heat. The air smelled like dust and manure and money about to change hands. Buyers arrived in tailored coats and polished boots. Men who represented syndicates and rail companies and ranches that spanned territories. They moved through the pens with notebooks and calculating eyes, assessing quality and estimating profit. Local ranchers stood in clusters, talking in low voices about prices and prospects. Sheriff Pike's deputies flanked the main gate, watching everyone who entered. Granger stood on a platform near the auctioneer's block, surveying his domain. He wore a vest embroidered with silver thread and a hat that cost more than most families earned in a year. He looked like a man who had never lost at anything, who believed he never would. I found my position near the front of the crowd, close enough to be heard, far enough that Pike's deputies would not notice me until I wanted them to. Lydia stood 15 feet to my right, her basket resting against her hip. Jasper leaned against a fence post, his face shadowed by his hat brim. The auction began. The auctioneer called lot numbers in a rapid chant that blurred words into rhythm. Buyers raised paddles. Stock moved through the pens in orderly rotation. Money flowed like water. Granger watched it all with a smile that said this was exactly how the world was supposed to work. Then came the horses from Pen B. The auctioneer announced the lot. Premium stock from Granger Holdings. 12 horses, prime breeding age, excellent conformation. The gates opened and the horses moved into the display pen. They were beautiful. Well-fed, well-trained, worth every dollar Granger would ask for them. I stepped forward, my voice cut through the auctioneer's chant like a blade through cloth. I said there was something the buyers should know before bidding started. Heads turned. The auctioneer faltered. Granger's smile froze on his face. I said my name was Marjorie Calder, that I was the daughter of a horse breeder whose stock had been stolen 15 years ago, that the man who stole those horses was standing on the platform in front of us, and that I could prove it. The crowd went silent. Not the silence of attention, but the silence of shock. No one interrupted an auction. No one accused Bartholomew Granger of anything, much less theft. Pike's deputies started moving toward me, but Pike himself raised a hand to stop them. He wanted to see where this was going. He wanted to know how much I knew. I pulled the horseshoe from my coat and held it up. The rust caught the morning light. I read the stamp aloud. BG Pen B, Gate G. I said this horseshoe came from a hidden cubby in the old livery stable, that it matched entries in a ledger I found in the same place. A ledger that recorded 15 years of illegal horse trading conducted under the cover of legitimate business. Lydia stepped forward then, moving with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. She opened her basket and pulled out both ledgers. She held them high enough for the crowd to see. She said one ledger came from the stable. The other, she had copied herself while binding Granger's records. That every entry matched. That every theft was documented. Granger's voice rang out, smooth and dismissive. He said this was nonsense. That desperate women made desperate accusations. That he had built his business on honest dealing and fair prices. That anyone who knew him understood his reputation. I asked if his reputation included forging brand transfer certificates. I pulled the copies from my pocket and read the dates aloud. August 1882, 6 horses with the Sea Star brand, listed as voluntarily surrendered by Calder Ranch. I said my father never surrendered anything. That his signature on those certificates was forged. That the horses were stolen and rebranded in Pen B before being shipped to Abilene under false papers. Jasper spoke then, his voice rough but clear. He said he witnessed it. That he worked the livery when the operation ran. That horses came through the east gate at night and left 2 days later with fresh brands. That Granger paid him to stay quiet and threatened him when he considered speaking. He pointed to 3 men in the crowd. Handlers who had worked the branding irons, men whose faces went pale when their names were called. One of the buyers, a man from Kansas City with a rail company portfolio, stepped forward. He asked to see the ledgers. Lydia handed them over without hesitation. The man read through entries with narrowing eyes. He asked Granger if he had documentation, proving the horses in Pen B were raised on Granger land. Granger said of course he did. The buyer asked to see it now. Pike tried to intervene. He said this was a disruption of lawful commerce, that accusations required evidence beyond hearsay and old ledgers. I looked at him and said his name appeared in both ledgers, that he took a broker's rate for facilitating the thefts, that he signed forged documents as a notary and used his position to ensure no one investigated too closely. Pike's face went red. He said I was lying, that I had no proof of his involvement. Lydia pulled out a third set of papers, brand registry documents with Pike's notary seal beside Granger's signature, dates that aligned perfectly with theft reports. Pike's hand moved toward his gun. Jasper stepped between us and said if Pike drew that weapon, everyone here would see exactly what he was. I raised my hand then, palm open. The signal Elias drove Penny through the east gate at a run. The mare's hooves thundered across the dirt. People turned to look. Elias guided her past Pen B along the exact route stolen horses had traveled for 15 years. The physical space mapped onto the accusations we had made. The crowd saw the path. They understood the geography of theft. Penny stopped at the display pen, breathing hard, her coat dark with sweat. Elias dismounted and stood beside her, one hand on her neck. He said this horse was found starving near our stable, that someone had discarded her when she was no longer useful, that this was what Granger did. He used what he wanted and threw away what he did not. The Kansas City buyer handed the ledgers to two other rail representatives. They conferred in low voices. One of them asked Granger directly if he had documentation proving legitimate acquisition of the stock in question. Granger said he did not need to prove anything, that his word was sufficient. The buyer said it was not, that rail companies could not risk investing in stock with questionable provenance, that if these accusations had merit, every horse Granger had sold in 15 years could be contested. The auction ground to a halt. Buyers withdrew their paddles. Ranchers who had done business with Granger started drifting toward the exits. Pike's deputies looked to their boss for orders, but Pike stood frozen, his authority crumbling in front of the crowd. Granger descended from the platform. He walked toward me with deliberate steps. His face was no longer handsome. It was the face of a man who had lost control and did not know how to get it back. He said, I would regret this, that I had destroyed myself along with him, that no one in this territory would do business with a woman who caused this much trouble. I said I had already lost everything he could take, that the only thing I had left was the truth, and the truth did not care about his reputation or his threats or his belief that powerful men could do whatever they wanted without consequence. A rail marshal who had been observing the auction stepped forward. He said he would be filing a report with the territorial judge, that an investigation would be opened into the ledgers and certificates, that anyone with relevant testimony should prepare to give depositions. He looked at Granger and said he should not plan on leaving Carden's Hollow anytime soon. Granger left without another word, his empire fracturing with every step he took. The territorial judge arrived 3 days later with a marshal and 2 clerks. They set up in the schoolhouse and began taking depositions. The process was slow and methodical. Every entry in the ledgers was verified against freight manifests and brand registries. Every signature was examined for authenticity. Jasper testified for 4 hours. Lydia presented her copied records with dates and locations, precise enough to withstand cross-examination. The handlers Jasper identified were brought in one by one. 2 of them confirmed the rebranding operation in exchange for immunity. Sheriff Pike was removed from office pending criminal charges. The judge appointed a temporary marshal to maintain order. Pike left town before the investigation concluded. No one tried to stop him. Some departures were their own kind of justice. 2 weeks after the auction, the judge posted his decision on the church door. The brand transfers were ruled fraudulent. Granger's claims to stock acquired through coerced sales were nullified. Reparations were ordered from Granger Holdings to be distributed among families whose animals had been stolen and rebranded. The decision listed 17 families by name. My father's name was first. Granger's empire collapsed faster than it had been built. Investors pulled out. Properties were seized to cover judgments. The man who had controlled Carden's Hollow for 15 years was escorted to the railhead under guard to await trial in the territorial capital. He did not look back. The restitution came in pieces. Land deeds restored, funds transferred from seized accounts. It was not everything my father had lost, but it was acknowledgement. Official recognition that what had been taken was theft, not misfortune. That our family's ruin had been engineered, not earned. I used the money to clear old debts and repair the stable properly. New beams replaced rotten ones. The roof was patched and sealed. The stalls were rebuilt with gates that closed smooth and latches that held. I commissioned a sign for the front entrance. Calder Stables, Training and Way Station. My father's name restored to a place that could speak it with pride. Penny became our first permanent resident. Elias fed her every morning and worked with her in the small corral behind the stable. She learned to trust slowly, the way animals do when they have been discarded and then reclaimed. Watching her gain weight and confidence felt like watching proof that broken things could be mended if someone cared enough to try. Lydia opened a small registry room beside her seamstress shop, a place where people could view public records without needing permission from men who controlled access. She kept the ledgers there under glass, not hidden, not burned, visible proof of what happened when truth was kept in shadows and what happened when it was finally brought into light. Jasper quit drinking. He showed up at the stable one morning and asked if I needed help with the yard work. I said I did. He swept the aisles every day at dawn, his movements careful and deliberate, like each pass of the broom was an apology he could not speak aloud. Some guilt could not be erased, but it could be balanced by better actions. That seemed like enough. The town changed slowly. Some people resented what I had done. They said I had ruined Carden's Hollow's reputation and driven away business. Others said I had done what should have been done years ago. That silence had cost too much and lasted too long. The division was uncomfortable, but it was honest. Comfortable lies had built this town. Uncomfortable truth would have to rebuild it. Elias apprenticed as a horseman and bookkeeper. He learned to train animals with patience and keep records with precision. He understood that both skills mattered, that knowing how to document truth was as important as knowing how to speak it. I watched him work and saw someone who would never let ledgers be hidden or brands be altered without consequence. The legacy I gave him was not land or money. It was the knowledge that fighting for what is right sometimes means risking everything, and that risk is always worth it. On a cool morning in late autumn, I stood at the stable entrance and looked down Main Street. The building I had bought for 90 cents was solid now, functional, a place that served its purpose. People brought horses for training and boarding. Travelers stopped for rest and supplies. The stable earned its keep. I thought about the ledger hidden in the wall, about the horseshoe stamped with initials that became evidence instead of a secret, about the choice to dig when everyone else looked away. I thought about my father and the horses he lost, and the way his name appeared first on the judge's restitution list. He did not live to see justice, but justice came anyway. Men bury the truth under the weight of money. They build empires on stolen ground and call it progress. They rely on fear and silence to keep the machinery running. But the ground always shifts in the end. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes someone stubborn enough to buy a worthless stable and look inside its walls. I bought that stable for 90 cents. It cost me much more than money to keep it, but standing here now, watching my son train a horse that was once starving and discarded, I understood that some prices are worth paying. The truth had finally seen daylight, and Carden's Hollow would never be the same. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.